The Narrow Land by Jack Vance. Originally published in the July 1967 issue of Fantastic magazine. It appeared in One More magazine in Dutch language in 1981. The remainder of its republishing can be found in multiple collections of the author's stories, including Morreion in 1978, Green Magic, The Fantasy Realms of Jack Vance in 1979, The Narrow Land in 1982, The Houses of Iszm and Other Stories in 2005, and Dream Castles, The Early Jack Vance, Volume 2 in 2012. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. The Narrow Land. A pair of nerves joined across the top of Earn's brain. He became conscious, aware of darkness and constriction. The sensation was uncomfortable. He tensed his members, thrust at the shell, meeting resistance in all directions except one. He kicked, butted, and presently created a rupture. The constriction eased somewhat. Earn squirmed around, clawed at the membrane, tore it back, and was met by a sudden, unpleasant exudation, the juices of a being not himself. It wrenched around, reached forth. Earn recoiled, struck back the probing members, which seemed ominously strong and massive. There was a period of passivity. Each found the other hateful. They were of the same sort, yet different. Presently, the two small creatures fought with little, near inaudible squeaks and chitters. Earn eventually strangled his opponent. When he tried to detach himself, he found that an adhesion of tissue had occurred, that the two were now one. Earn expanded himself, surrounded and fused with the defeated individual. For a further period, Earn rested, exploring his consciousness. The constriction once again became oppressive. Earn thrust and kicked, creating a new rupture, and the shell split wide. Earn struggled forth into soft slime, then up into a glare of light, an acrid, dry void. From above came a harsh cry. An enormous shape hurtled down. Earn dodged, evaded a pair of clicking black prongs. He flapped, paddled, slid down into cool water, where he submerged himself. Others inhabited the water. Earn saw their dim shapes to all sides. Some were like himself, pale, pop-eyed sprats, narrow-skulled, with wisps of film for crests. Others were larger, with the legs and arms definitely articulated, the crests stiffer, the skin tough and silver-gray. Earn bestirred himself, tested his arms and legs. He swam, carefully at first, then with competence. Hunger came. He ate. Larvae, nodules on the roots of reeds, trifles of this and that. So Earn entered his childhood and gradually became wise in the ways of the water world. Duration could not be measured. There was no basis for time, no alteration of light and darkness, no change except for Earn's own growth. The only notable events of the sea shallows were the tragedies. A water baby frolicking too far, recklessly, offshore, might be caught in a current and swept out under the storm curtain. The armored birds, from time to time, carried away a very young baby basking at the surface. Most dreadful of all was the ogre who lived in one of the sea sloughs, a brutish creature with long arms, a flat face, and 4 bony ridges over the top of its skull. On one occasion, Earn almost became its victim. Skulking under the roots of the swamp reeds, the ogre lunged forth. Earn felt the swirl of water and darted away, the ogre's grasp so near that the claws scraped his leg. The ogre pursued, making idiotic sounds, then jerking aside, seized one of Earn's playfellows and settled to the bottom to munch upon its captive. After Ern grew large enough to defy the predator birds, he spent much time on the surface, tasting the air and marveling at the largeness of the vistas, though he understood nothing of what he saw. The sky was a dull gray fog, somewhat brighter out over the sea, never changing except for an occasional wind-whipped cloud or a trail of rain. Close at hand was the swamp. Sloughs, low-lying islands overgrown with pallid reeds, complicated black shrubs of the utmost fragility, a few spindly dendrons. Beyond hung a wall of black murk. On the seaward side, the horizon was obscured by a lightning-shattered wall of cloud and rain. The wall of murk and the wall of storm ran parallel, delineating the borders of the region between. The larger of the water children tended to congregate at the surface. There were two sorts. The typical individual was slender and lithe, with a narrow, bony skull, a single crest, protuberant eyes. His temperament was mercurial. He tended to undignified wrangling and sudden brisk fights, which were over almost as soon as they started. The sex differences were definite. Some were male, half as many were female. In contrast, and much in the minority, were the twin-crested water children. These were more massive, with broader skulls, less prominent eyes, and a more sedate disposition. Their sexual differentiation was not obvious, and they regarded the antics of the single-crested children with disapproval. Ern identified himself with this latter group, though his crest development was not yet definite, and, if anything, he was even broader and more stocky than the others. Sexually, he was slow in developing, but he seemed definitely masculine. The oldest of the children, single and double-crested alike, knew a few elements of speech, passed down the classes from a time and source unknown. In due course, Ern learned the language, and thereafter idled away long periods discussing the events of the sea shallows. The wall of storm, with its incessant dazzle of lightning, was continually fascinating. But the children gave most of their attention to the swamp and rising ground beyond, where, by virtue of tradition transmitted along with the language, they knew their destiny lay among the men. Occasionally, men would be seen probing the shore mud for flatfish or moving among the reeds on mysterious errands. At such times, the water children, impelled by some unknown emotion, would instantly submerge themselves, all except the most daring of the single-crested, who would float with only their eyes above water to watch the men at their fascinating activities. Each appearance of the men stimulated discussion among the water children. The single-crested maintained that all would become men and walk the dry land, which they declared to be a condition of bliss. The double-crested, more skeptical, agreed that the children might go ashore. After all, this was the tradition, but what next? Tradition offered no information on this score, and the discussions remained speculative. At long last, Ern saw men close at hand. Searching the bottom for crustaceans, he heard a strong, rhythmic splashing, and, looking up, saw three large, long figures, magnificent creatures. They swam with power and grace. Even the ogre might avoid such as these. Ern followed at a discreet distance, wondering if he dared approach and make himself known. It would be pleasant, he thought, to talk with these men, to learn about life on the shore. The men paused to inspect a school of playing children, pointing here and there, while the children halted their play to stare up in wonder. Now occurred a shocking incident. The largest of the double-crested water children was Iszm, the name-giver, a creature by Ern's reckoning old and wise. It was Iszm's prerogative to ordain names for his fellows. Ern had received his name from Iszm. It now chanced that Iszm, unaware of the men, wandered into view. The men pointed, uttered sharp guttural cries, and plunged below the surface. Iszm startled into immobility, hesitated an instant, then darted away. The men pursued, harrying him this way and that, apparently intent on his capture. Iszm, wild with fear, swam far offshore, out over the gulf, where the current took him and carried him away, out toward the curtain of storm. The men, exclaiming in anger, plunged landward in foaming strokes of arms and legs. In fascinated curiosity, Earn followed, up a large slough, finally to a beach of packed mud. The men waded ashore, strode off among the reeds. Earn drifted slowly forward, beset by a quivering conflict of impulses. How, he wondered, could beings so magnificent hound Iszm the name-giver to his doom? The land was close. The footprints of the men were plain on the mud of the beach. Where did they lead? What wonderful new vistas lay beyond the line of reeds? Earn eased forward to the beach. He lowered his feet and tried to walk. His legs felt limp and flexible. Only by dint of great concentration was he able to set one foot before the other. Deprived of the support of the water, his body felt gross and clumsy. From the reeds came a screech of amazement. Earn's legs, suddenly capable, carried him in wobbling leaps down the beach. He plunged into the water, swam frantically back along the slough. Behind him came men, churning the water. Earn ducked aside, hid behind a clump of rotting reeds. The men continued down the slough, out over the shallows where they spent a fruitless period ranging back and forth. Earn remained in his cover. The men returned, passing no more than the length of their bodies from Earn's hiding place, so close that he could see their glittering eyes and the dark yellow interior of their oral cavities when they gasped for air. With their spare frames, prow-shaped skulls, and single crests, they resembled neither Earn nor Iszm, but rather the single-crested water children. These were not his sort. He was not a man. Perplexed, seething with excitement and dissatisfaction, Earn returned to the shallows. But nothing was as before. The innocence of the easy old life had departed. There was now a portent in the air which soured the pleasant old routines. Earn found it hard to wrench his attention away from the shore, and he considered the single-crested children, his erstwhile playmates, with new wariness. They suddenly seemed strange, different from himself, and they in turn watched the double-crested children with distrust, swimming away in startled shoals when Earn or one of the others came by. Earn became morose and dour. The old satisfactions were gone. There were no compensations. Twice again, the men swam out across the shallows, but all the double-crested children, Earn among them, hid under reeds. The men thereupon appeared to lose interest, and for a period life went on more or less as before. But change was in the wind. The shoreline became a preoccupation. What lay behind the reed islands and the wall of murk? Where did the men live? In what wonderful surroundings? With the most extreme vigilance against the ogre, Earn swam up the largest of the sloughs. To either side were islands overgrown with pale reeds, with an occasional black skeleton tree or a globe of tanglebush, stuff so fragile as to collapse at a touch. The slough branched, opening into still coves reflecting the gray gloom of the sky, and at last narrowed, dwindling to a channel of black slime. Earn dared proceed no farther. If someone or something had followed him, he was trapped. And at this moment a strange yellow creature halted overhead to hover on 1,000 tinkling scales. Spying Earn, it set up a wild ululation. Off in the distance, Earn thought to hear a call of harsh voices. Men. He swung around and swam back the way he had come, with the tinkle bird careening above. Ern ducked under the surface, swam down the slough at full speed. Presently, he went to the side, cautiously surfaced. The yellow bird swung in erratic circles over the point where he had submerged, its quavering howl now diminished to a mournful hooting sound. Ern gratefully returned to the shallows. It was now clear to him that if ever he wished to go ashore, he must learn to walk. To the perplexity of his fellows, even those of the double crests, he began to clamber up through the mud of the near island, exercising his legs among the reeds. All went passably well, and Ern presently found himself walking without effort, though as yet he dared not try the land behind the islands. Instead, he swam along the coast, the storm wall on his right hand, the shore on his left. On and on he went, further than he had ever ventured before. The storm wall was changeless, a roll of rain and a thick vapor lanced with lightning. The wall of murk was the same, dense black at the horizon, lightening by imperceptible gradations to become the normal gray gloom of the sky overhead. The narrow land extended endlessly onward. Ern saw new swamps, reed islands, shelves of muddy foreshore, a split of sharp rocks. At length the shore curved away, retreated toward the wall of murk to form a funnel-shaped bay into which poured a freezingly cold river. Ern swam to the shore, crawled up on the shingle, stood swaying on his still uncertain legs. Far across the bay, new swamps and islands continued to the verge of vision and beyond. There was no living creature in sight. Ern stood alone on the gravel bar, a small gray figure, swaying on still limber legs, peering earnestly this way and that. The river curved away and out of sight into the darkness. The water of the estuary was bitterly cold. The current ran swift. Ern decided to go no farther. He slipped into the sea and returned the way he had come. Back in the familiar shallows, he took up his old routine, searching the bottom for crustaceans, taunting the ogre, floating on the surface with a wary eye for men, testing his legs on the island. During one of the visits ashore, he came upon a most unusual sight, a woman depositing eggs in the mud. From behind a curtain of reeds, Ern watched in fascination. The woman was not quite so large as the men and lacked the harsh male facial structure, though her cranial ridge was no less prominent. She wore a shawl of a dark red woven stuff, the first garment Ern had ever seen, and he marveled at the urbanity of the men's way of life. The woman was busy for some time. When she departed, Ern went to examine the eggs. They had been carefully protected from armored birds by a layer of mud and a neat little tent of plaited reeds. The nest contained 3 clutches, each a row of 3 eggs, each egg carefully separated from the next by a wad of mud. So here, thought Ern, was the origin of the water babies. He recalled the circumstances of his own birth. Evidently he had emerged from just such an egg. Rearranging mud and tent, Ern left the eggs as he had found them and returned to the water. Time passed. The men came no more. Ern wondered that they should abandon an occupation in which they had showed so vigorous an interest. But then the whole matter exceeded the limits of his understanding. He became prey to restlessness once again. In this regard he seemed unique. None of his fellows had ever wandered beyond the shallows. Ern set off along the shore, this time swimming with the storm wall to his left. He crossed the slough in which lived the ogre, who glared up as Ern passed and made a threatening gesture. Ern swam hastily on, though now he was of a size larger than that which the ogre preferred to attack. The shore on this side of the shallows was more interesting and varied than that to the other. He came upon 3 high islands crowned with a varied vegetation, black skeleton trees, stalks with bundles of pink and white foliage clenched in black fingers, glossy, lamellar pillars, the topmost scales billowing out into gray leaves. Then the islands were no more, and the mainland rose directly from the sea. Earn swam close to the beach to avoid the currents, and presently came to a spit of shingle pushing out into the sea. He climbed ashore and surveyed the landscape. The ground slanted up under a cover of umbrella trees, then rose sharply to become a rocky bluff crested with black and gray vegetation, the most notable sight of Earn's experience. Earn slid back into the sea, swam on. The landscape slackened, became flat and swampy. He swam past a bank of black slime overgrown with squirming yellow-green fibrils, which he took care to avoid. Some time later he heard a thrashing, hissing sound, and, looking to see, observed an enormous white worm sliding through the water. Earn floated quietly, and the worm slid on past and away. Earn continued. On and on he swam, until, as before, the shore was broken by an estuary leading away into the murk. Wading up the beach, Earn looked far and wide across a dismal landscape supporting only tatters of brown lichen. The river which flooded the estuary seemed even larger and swifter than the one he had seen previously, and carried an occasional chunk of ice. A bitter wind blew toward the storm wall, creating a field of retreating whitecaps. The opposite shore, barely visible, showed no relief or contrast. There was no apparent termination to the narrow land. It appeared to reach forever between the walls of storm and gloom. Earn returned to the shallows, not wholly satisfied with what he had learned. He had seen marvels unknown to his fellows, but what had they taught him? Nothing. His questions remained unanswered. Changes were taking place. They could not be ignored. The whole of Earn's class lived at the surface, breathing air. Infected by some pale dilution of Earn's curiosity, they stared uneasily landward. Sexual differentiation was evident. There were tendencies towards sexual play, from which the double-crested children with undeveloped organs stood contemptuously aloof. Social as well as physical distinctions developed. There began to be an interchange of taunts and derogation, occasionally a brief skirmish. Earn ranged himself with the double-crested children, although on exploring his own scalp, he found only indecisive hummocks and hollows, which to some extent embarrassed him. In spite of the general sense of imminence, the coming of the men took the children by surprise. In the number of 200, the men came down the sloughs and swam out to surround the shallows. Earn and a few others instantly clambered up among the reeds of the island and concealed themselves. The other children milled and swam in excited circles. The men shouted, slapped the water with their arms, diving and veering. They herded the water children up the slough, all the way to the beach of dried mud. Here they chose and sorted, sending the largest up the beach, allowing the fingerlings and sprats to return to the shallows, taking the double-crested children with sharp cries of exultation. The selection was complete. The captive children were marshaled into groups and sent staggering up the trail. Those with legs still soft were carried. Earn, fascinated by the process, watched from a discreet distance. When men and children had disappeared, he emerged from the water, clambered up the beach to look after his departed friends. What to do now? Return to the shallows? The old life seemed drab and insipid. He dared not present himself to the men. They were single-crested. They were harsh and abrupt. What remained? He looked back and forth between water and land, and at last gave his youth a melancholy farewell. Henceforth he would live ashore. He walked a few steps up the path, stopped to listen. Silence. He proceeded warily, prepared to duck into the undergrowth at a sound. The soil underfoot became less sodden. The reeds disappeared, and aromatic black cycads lined the path. Above rose slender, supple withes, with gas-filled leaves, half floating, half supported. Earn moved ever more cautiously, pausing to listen ever more frequently. What if he met the men? Would they kill him? Earn hesitated and even looked back along the path. The decision had been made. He continued forward. A sound from somewhere not too far ahead. Earn dodged off the path, flattened himself behind a hummock. No one appeared. Earn moved forward through the cycads, and presently, through the black fronds, he saw the village of the men, a marvel of ingenuity and complication. Nearby stood tall bins containing foodstuffs, then, at a little distance, a row of thatched stalls, stacked with poles, coils of rope, pots of pigment and grease. Yellow tinklebirds, perched on the gables, made a constant chuckling clamor. The bins and stalls faced an open space surrounding a large platform, where a ceremony of obvious import was in progress. On the platform stood 4 men, draped in bands of woven leaves, and 4 women wearing dark red shawls and tall hats decorated with tinklebird scales. Beside the platform, in a miserable gray clot, huddled the single-crested children, the individuals distinguishable only by an occasional gleam of eye or twitch of pointed crest. One by one, the children were lifted up to the 4 men, who gave each a careful examination. Most of the male children were dismissed and sent down into the crowd. The rejects, about 1 in every 10, were killed by the blow of a stone mallet and propped up to face the wall of storm. The girl children were sent to the other end of the platform, where the 4 women waited. Each of the trembling girl children was considered in turn. About half were discharged from the platform into the custody of a woman and taken to a booth. About 1 in every 5 was daubed along the skull with white paint and sent to a nearby pen, where the double-crested children were also confined. The rest suffered a blow of the mallet. The corpses were propped to face the wall of murk. Above Earn's head sounded the mindless howl of a tinklebird. Earn darted back into the brush. The bird drifted overhead on clashing scales. Men ran to either side, chased Earn back and forth, and finally captured him. He was dragged to the village, thrust triumphantly up on the platform amid calls of surprise and excitement. The 4 priests, or whatever their function, surrounded Earn to make their examination. There was a new set of startled outcries. The priests stood back in perplexity, then, after a mumble of discussion, signaled to the priest women. The mallet was brought forward, but was never raised. A man from the crowd jumped up on the platform to argue with the priests. They made a second careful study of Earn's head, muttering to each other. Then one brought a knife, another clamped Earn's head. The knife was drawn the length of his cranium, first to the left of the central ridge, then to the right, to produce a pair of near-parallel cuts. Orange blood trickled down Earn's face. Pain made him tense and stiff. A woman brought forward a handful of some vile substance which she rubbed into the wounds. Then all stood away, murmuring and speculating. Earn glared back, half mad with fear and pain. He was led to a booth, thrust within. Bars were dropped across the aperture and laced with thongs. Earn watched the remainder of the ceremony. The corpses were dismembered, boiled, and eaten. The white-daubed girl children were marshaled into a group with all those double-crested children with whom Earn had previously identified himself. Why? He wondered. Had he not been included in this group? Why had he first been threatened with the mallet, then wounded with the knife? The situation was incomprehensible. The girls and the two crested children were marched away through the brush. The other girls, with no more ado, became members of the community. The male children underwent a much more formal instruction. Each man took one of the boys under his sponsorship and subjected him to a rigorous discipline. There were lessons in deportment, knot tying, weaponry, language, dancing, the various outcries. Earn received minimal attention. He was fed regularly, as occasion seemed to warrant. The period of his confinement could not be defined, the changeless gray sky providing no chronometric reference, and indeed the concept of time as a succession of definite interims was foreign to Earn's mind. He escaped apathy only by attending the instruction in adjoining booths, where single-crested boys were taught language and deportment. Earn learned the language long before those under instruction. He and his double-crested fellows had used the rudiments of this language in the long-gone halcyon past. The twin wounds along Earn's skull eventually healed, leaving parallel wheals of scar tissue. The black feathery combs of maturity were likewise sprouting, covering his entire scalp with down. None of his erstwhile comrades paid him any heed. They had become indoctrinated in the habits of the village. The old life of the Shallows had receded in their memories. Watching them stride past his prison, Earn found them increasingly apart from himself. They were lithe, slender, agile, like tall, keen-featured lizards. He was heavier, with blunter features, a broader head. His skin was tougher and thicker, a darker gray. He was now almost as large as the men, though by no means so sinewy and quick. When need arose, they moved with mercurial rapidity. Once or twice, Earn, in a fury, attempted to break the bars of his booth, only to be prodded with a pole for his trouble, and he therefore desisted from this unprofitable exercise. He became fretful and bored. The booths to either side were now used only for copulation, an activity which Earn observed with dispassionate interest. The booth at last was opened. Earn rushed forth, hoping to surprise his captors and win free, but one man seized him. Another looped a rope around his body. Without ceremony, he was led from the village. The men offered no hint of their intentions. Jogging along at a half-trot, they took Earn through the black brush in that direction known as sea left, which was to say, with the sea on the left hand. The trail veered inland, rising over bare hummocks, dropping into dark swales, brimming with rank black dendrons. Ahead loomed a great copse of umbrella trees, impressively tall, each stalk as thick as the body of a man, each billowing leaf large enough to envelop a half-dozen booths like that in which Earn had been imprisoned. Someone had been at work. A number of the trees had been cut, the poles trimmed and neatly stacked, the leaves cut into rectangular sheets and draped over ropes. The racks supporting the poles had been built with meticulous accuracy, and Earn wondered who had done such precise work. Certainly not the men of the village, whose construction even Earn found haphazard. A path led away through the forest, a path straight as a string, of constant width, delineated by parallel lines of white stones, a technical achievement far beyond the capacity of the men, thought Earn. The men now became furtive and uneasy. Earn tried to hang back, certain that whatever the men had in mind was not to his advantage, but willy-nilly he was jerked forward. The path made an abrupt turn, marched up a swale between copses of black-brown cycads, turned out upon a field of soft white moss at the center of which stood a large and splendid village. The men, pausing in the shadows, made contemptuous sounds, performing insulting acts, provoked, so Earn suspected, by envy, for the village across the meadow surpassed that of his captors as much as that village excelled the environment of the Shallows. There were 8 precisely spaced rows of huts, built of sawed planks, decorated or given symbolic import by elaborate designs of blue, maroon, and black. At the sea right and sea left ends of the central avenue stood larger constructions with high peaked roofs, shingled, like all the others, with slabs of biotite. Notably absent were disorder and refuse. This village, unlike the village of the single-crested men, was fastidiously neat. Behind the village rose the great bluff Earn had noticed on his exploration of the coast. At the edge of the meadow stood a row of 6 stakes, and to the first of these the men tied Earn. "This is the village of the Twos," declared one of the men. "Folk such as yourself, do not mention that we cut your scalp or affairs will go badly." They moved back, taking cover under a bank of worm plants. Earn strained at his bonds, convinced that no matter what the eventuality, it could not be to his benefit. The villagers had taken note of Earn. 10 persons set forth across the meadow. In front came 4 splendid Twos, stepping carefully with an exaggerated strutting gait, followed by 6 young One-girls, astoundingly urbane in gowns of wadded umbrella leaf. The girls had been disciplined. They no longer used ordinary sinuous motion, but walked in a studied simulation of the 2 attitudes. Earn stared in fascination. The Twos appeared to be of his own sort, sturdier and heavier than the cleaver-headed Ones. The pair in the van apparently shared equal authority. They comported themselves with canonical dignity, and their garments, fringed shawls of black, brown, and purple, boots of gray membrane with metal clips, metal filigree greaves, were formalized and elaborate. He, on the stormward side, wore a crest of glittering metal barbs. He, on the darkward side, a double row of tall black plumes. The Twos at their back seemed of somewhat lesser prestige. They wore caps of complicated folds and tucks and carried halberds 3 times their own length. At the rear walked the One-girls, carrying parcels. Earn saw them to be members of his own class, part of the group which had been led away after the selection ritual. Their skin had been stained dark red and yellow. They wore dull yellow caps, yellow shawls, yellow sandals, and walked with the mincing, delicate rigidity in which they had been schooled. The foremost Twos, halting at either side of Earn, examined him with portentous gravity. The halberdiers fixed him with a minatory stare. The girls posed in self-conscious attitudes. The Twos squinted in puzzlement at the double ridges of scar tissue along his scalp. They arrived at a dubious consensus. "He appears sound, if somewhat gross of body and oddly ridged." One of the halberdiers, propping his weapon against a stake, unbound Earn, who stood tentatively, half of a mind to take to his heels. The 2 wearing the crest of metal barbs inquired, "Do you speak?" "Yes." "You must say, 'Yes, preceptor of the storm dazzle.' Such is the form." Earn found the admonition puzzling, but no more so than the other attributes of the Twos. His best interests, so he decided, lay in cautious cooperation. The Twos, while arbitrary and capricious, apparently did not intend him harm. The girls arranged the parcels beside the stake. Payment, so it seemed, to the One-men. "Come, then," commanded he of the black plumes. "Watch your feet, walk correctly. Do not swing your arms. You are a 2, an important individual. You must act appropriately, according to the way." "Yes, preceptor of the storm dazzle." "You will address me as preceptor of the dark chill." Confused and apprehensive, Earn was marched across the meadow of pale moss. The trail, demarcated now by lines of black stones, bestrewn with black gravel and glistening in the damp, exactly bisected the meadow, which was lined to either side by tall black-brown fan trees. First walked the preceptors, then Earn, then the halberdiers, and finally the 6 girls. The trail connected with the central avenue of the village, which opened at the center into a square plaza paved with squares of wood. To the darkward side of the plaza stood a tall black tower supporting a set of peculiar black objects. On the stormward side, an identical white tower presented lightning symbols. Across and set back in a widening of the avenue was a long 2-story hall to which Earn was conducted and lodged in a cubicle. A third pair of 2s, of rank higher than the halberdiers but lower than the preceptors, the pedagogue of the Stormdazzle and the pedagogue of the Dark Chill, took Earn in charge. He was washed, anointed with oil, and again the wheals along his scalp received a puzzled inspection. Earn began to suspect that the 1s had used duplicity, that in order to sell him to the 2s, they had simulated double ridges across his scalp, and that, after all, he was merely a peculiar variety of 1. It was indeed a fact that his sexual parts resembled those of the 1 men rather than the epicene, or perhaps atrophied, organs of the 2s. The suspicion made him more uneasy than ever, and he was relieved when the pedagogues brought him a cap, half of silver scales, half of glossy black bird fiber, which covered his scalp, and a shawl hanging across his chest and belted at the waist, which concealed his sex organs. As with every other aspect and activity of the 2 village, there were niceties of usage in regard to the cap. The way requires that in low ceremonial activity you must stand with black toward night and silver toward chaos. If a ritual or other urgency impedes, reverse your cap. This was the simplest and least complicated of the decorums to be observed. The pedagogues found much to criticize in Earn's deportment. "You are somewhat more crude and gross than the usual cadet," remarked the pedagogue of Stormdazzle. "The injury to your head has affected your condition." "You will be carefully schooled," the pedagogue of Dark Chill told him. "As of this moment, consider yourself a mental void." A dozen other young 2s, including 4 from Earn's class, were undergoing tutelage. As instruction was on an individual basis, Earn saw little of them. He studied diligently and assimilated knowledge with a facility which won him grudging compliments. When he seemed proficient in primary methods, he was introduced to cosmology and religion. "We inhabit the narrow land," declared the pedagogue of Stormdazzle. "It extends forever. How can we assert this with such confidence? Because we know that the opposing principles of Storm and Dark Chill, being divine, are infinite. Therefore the narrow land, the region of confrontation, likewise is infinite." Earn ventured a question. "What exists behind the wall of storm?" "There is no behind. Storm chaos is, and dazzles the dark with his lightnings. This is the masculine principle. Dark Chill, the feminine principle, is. She accepts the rage and fire and quells it. We 2s partake of each. We are at equilibrium, and hence excellent." Earn broached a perplexing topic. "The 2 women do not produce eggs?" "There are neither 2 women nor 2 men. We are brought into being by dual divine intervention when a pair of eggs in a one-woman's clutch are put down in juxtaposition. Through alternation, these are always male and female, and so yield a double individual, neutral and dispassionate, symbolized by the paired cranial ridges. One men and one women are incomplete, forever driven by the urge to couple. Only fusion yields the true two. It was evident to Earn that questioning disturbed the pedagogues, so he desisted from further interrogation, not wishing to call attention to his usual attributes. During instruction, he had sensibly increased in size. The combs of maturity were growing up over his scalp. His sexual organs had developed noticeably. Both, luckily, were concealed by cap and shawl. In some fashion he was different from other twos, and the pedagogues, should they discover this fact, would feel dismay and confusion, at the very least. Other matters troubled Earn, namely the impulses aroused within himself by the slave one-girls. Such tendencies were defined to be ignoble. This was no way for a two to act. The pedagogues would be horrified to learn of his leanings. But if he were not a two, what was he? Earn tried to quell his hot blood by extreme diligence. He began to study the two technology, which, like every other aspect of two society, was rationalized in terms of formal dogma. He learned the methods of collecting bog iron, of smelting, casting, forging, hardening, and tempering. Occasionally he wondered how the skills had first been evolved, inasmuch as empiricism, as a mode of thought, was antithetical to the dual way. Earn thoughtlessly touched upon the subject during a recitation. Both pedagogues were present. The pedagogue of Stormdazzle replied, somewhat tartly, that all knowledge was a dispensation of the two basic principles. "In any event," stated the pedagogue of Dark Chill, "the matter is irrelevant. What is, and by this token is optimum." "Indeed," remarked the pedagogue of Stormdazzle, "the very fact that you have formed this inquiry betrays a disorganized mind, more typical of a freak than a two." "What is a freak?" asked Earn. The pedagogue of Dark Chill made a stern gesture. "Once again your mentality tends to random association and discontent with authority." "Respectfully, pedagogue of Dark Chill, I wish only to learn the nature of wrong, so that I may know its distinction from right." "It suffices that you imbue yourself with right, with no reference whatever to wrong." With this viewpoint, Earn was forced to be content. The pedagogues, leaving the chamber, glanced back at him. Earn heard a fragment of their muttered conversation. "Surprising perversity, but for the evidence of the cranial ridges." In perturbation, Earn walked back and forth across his cubicle. He was different from the other cadets, so much was clear. At the refectory, where the cadets were brought nutriment by one-girls, Earn covertly scrutinized his fellows. While only little less massive than himself, they seemed differently proportioned, almost cylindrical, with features and protrusions less prominent. If he were different, what kind of person was he? A freak? What was a freak? A masculine two? Earn was inclined to credit this theory, for it explained his interest in the one-girls, and he turned to watch them gliding back and forth with trays. In spite of their oneness, they were undeniably appealing. Thoughtfully, Earn returned to his cubicle. In due course, a one-girl came past. Earn summoned her into the cubicle and made his wishes known. She showed surprise and uneasiness, though no great disinclination. "You are supposed to be neutral. What will everyone think?" "Nothing whatever, if they are unaware of the situation." "True, but is the matter feasible? I am one, and you are a two. The matter may or may not be feasible. How will the truth be known unless it is attempted? Orthodoxy notwithstanding." "Well, then, as you will." A monitor looked into the cubicle to stare dumbfounded. "What goes on here?" He looked more closely, then tumbled backward into the compound to shout, "A freak! A freak! Here among us! A freak! To arms! Kill the freak!" Earn thrust the girl outside. "Mingle with the others. Deny everything. I now feel that I must leave." He ran out upon the central avenue, looked up and down. The halberdiers, informed of emergency, were arraying themselves in formally appropriate gear. Earn took advantage of the delay to run from the village. In pursuit came the twos, calling threats and ritual abuse. The sea-right path toward the pole forest and the swamp was closed to him. Earn fled sea-left toward the great bluff, dodging among fan trees and banks of wormweed. Finally, hiding under a bank of fungus, he gained a respite while the halberdiers raced past. Emerging from his covert, Earn stood uncertainly, wondering which way to go. Freak or not, the twos had exhibited what seemed an irrational antagonism. Why had they attacked him? He had performed no damage, perpetrated no willful deception. The fault lay with the ones. In order to deceive the twos, they had scarred Earn's head, a situation for which Earn could hardly be held accountable. Bewildered and depressed, Earn started toward the shore, where at least he could find food. Crossing a peat bog, he was sighted by the halberdiers, who instantly set up the outcry, "Freak! Freak! Freak!" And again Earn was forced to run for his life. Up through a forest of mingled cycads and pole trees toward the great bluff, which now loomed ahead. A massive stone wall barred his way, a construction obviously of great age, overgrown with black and brown lichen. Earn ran staggering and wobbling along the wall, with the halberdiers close upon him, still screaming, "Freak! Freak! Freak!" A gap appeared in the wall. Earn jumped through to the opposite side, ducked behind a clump of feather bush. The halberdiers stopped short in front of the gap, their cries stilled, and now they seemed to be engaged in controversy. Earn waited despondently for discovery and death, since the bush offered scant concealment. One of the halberdiers at last ventured gingerly through the wall, only to give a startled grunt and jump back. There were receding footsteps, then silence. Earn crawled cautiously from his hiding place and went to peer through the gap. The twos had departed. Peculiar, thought Earn. They must have known he was close at hand. He turned. 10 paces distant, the largest man he had yet seen leaned on a sword, inspecting him with a brooding gaze. The man was almost twice the size of the largest two. He wore a dull brown smock of soft leather, a pair of shining metal wristbands. His skin was a heavy rugose gray, tough as horn. At the joints of his arms and legs were bony juts, ridges, and buttresses, which gave him the semblance of enormous power. His skull was broad, heavy, harshly indented and ridged. His eyes were blazing crystals in deep shrouded sockets. Along his scalp ran 3 serrated ridges. In addition to his sword, he carried, slung over his shoulder, a peculiar metal device with a long nozzle. He advanced a slow step. Earn swayed back, but for some reason beyond his own knowing was dissuaded from taking to his heels. The man spoke in a hoarse voice. "Why do they hunt you?" Earn took courage from the fact that the man had not killed him out of hand. They called me freak and drove me forth.
Freak?
The three considered Earn's scalp.
You are a two.
The ones cut my head to make scars, then sold me to the twos. Earn felt the wheels. On either side and at the center, almost as prominent as the scars, were the crests of an adult, 3 in number. They were growing apace. Even had he not compromised himself, the twos must have found him out on the first occasion he removed his cap. It appears that I am a freak, like yourself. The three made a brusque sound.
Come with me.
They walked back through the grove to a path which slanted up the bluff, then swung to the side and entered a valley. Beside a pond rose a great stone hall flanked by 2 towers with steep conical roofs. In spite of age and dilapidation, a structure to stagger Earn's imagination. By a timber portal, they entered a courtyard which seemed to Earn a place of unparalleled charm. At the far end, boulders and a great overhanging slab created the effect of a grotto. Within were trickling water, growths of feathery black moss, pale cycads, a settle padded with woven reed and sphagnum. The open area was a swamp garden, exhaling the odors of reed, water-soaked vegetation, resinous wood. Remarkable, thought Earn, as well as enchanting. Neither the ones nor the twos contrived except for an immediate purpose. The three took Earn across the court into a stone chamber, also half open to the refreshing drizzle, carpeted with packed sphagnum. Under the shelter of the ceiling were the appurtenances of the three's existence: crocks and bins, a table, a cabinet, tools and implements. The three pointed to a bench.
Sit.
Earn gingerly obeyed.
You are hungry?
No.
How was your imposture discovered?
Earn related the circumstances which led to his exposure. The three showed no disapproval, which gave Earn encouragement. I had long suspected that I was something other than a 2.
You are obviously a 3,
said his host.
Unlike the neuter 2s, 3s are notably masculine, which explains your inclinations for the one woman. Unluckily, there are no 3 females.
He looked at Earn.
They did not tell you how you were born?
I am the fusion of 1 eggs.
True. The one woman lays eggs of alternate sex in clutches of 3. The pattern is male, female, male. Such is the nature of her organism. A sheath forms on the interior of her ovipositor. As the eggs emerge, a sphincter closes to encapsulate the eggs. If she is careless, she will fail to separate the eggs and will put down a clutch with 2 eggs in contact. The male breaks into the female shell. There is fusion. A 2 is hatched. At the rarest of intervals, 3 eggs are so joined. One male fuses with the female, then so augmented, he breaks into the final egg and assimilates the other male. The result is a male 3.
Earn recalled his first memory. I was alone. I broke into the male-female shell. We fought at length. The 3 reflected for a lengthy period. Earn wondered if he had committed an annoyance. Finally, the 3 said,
I am named Mazar the Final. Now that you are here, I can be known as the Final, no longer. I am accustomed to solitude. I have become old and severe. You may find me poor company. If such is the case, you are free to pursue existence elsewhere. If you choose to stay, I will teach you what I know, which is perhaps pointless activity, since the 2s will presently come in a great army to kill us both.
I will stay, said Earn. As of now, I know only the ceremonies of the 2s, which I may never put to use. Are there no other 3s?
The 2s have killed all. All but Mazar the final.
And Earn.
And now Earn.
What of sea left and sea right, beyond the rivers, along other shores? Are there no more men?
Who knows? The wall of storm confronts the wall of dark. The narrow land extends. How far? Who knows? If to infinity, then all possibilities must be realized. Then there are other ones, twos and threes. If the narrow land terminates at chaos, then we may be alone.
I have traveled sea right and sea left until wide rivers stopped me, said Earn. The narrow land continued without any sign of coming to an end. I believe that it must extend to infinity. In fact, it is hard to conceive of a different situation.
Perhaps,
said Mazar gruffly.
Come.
He conducted Earn about the hall, through workshops and repositories, chambers crowded with mementos, trophies, and nameless paraphernalia. Who used these marvelous objects? Were there many threes?
At one time there were many,
intoned Mazar, in a voice as hoarse and dreary as the sound of wind.
It was so long ago that I cannot put words to the thought. I am the last.
Why were there so many then and so few now?
It is a melancholy tale. One tribe lived along the shore with customs different from the ones of the swamp. They were a gentle people, and they were ruled by a three who had been born by accident. He was Mina, the origin, and he caused the women to produce clutches with the eggs purposely joined, so that a large number of threes came into being. It was a great era. We were dissatisfied with the harsh life of the ones, the rigid life of the twos. We created a new existence. We learned the use of iron and steel. We built this hall and many more. The ones and twos both learned from us and profited.
Why did they war upon you?
By our freedom we incurred their fear. We set out to explore the narrow land. We traveled many leagues, sea left and sea right. An expedition penetrated the dark chill to a wilderness of ice, so dark that the explorers walked with torches. We built a raft and sent it to drift under the wall of storm. There were 3 ones aboard. The raft was tethered with a long cable. When we pulled it back, the ones had been riven by Dazzle and were dead. By these acts we infuriated the 2 preceptors. They declared us impious and marshaled the ones of the swamp. They massacred the ones of the shore. Then they made war on the threes. Ambush, poison, pitfall. They showed no mercy. We killed twos. There were always more twos, but never more threes. I could tell long tales of the war, how each of my comrades met death. Of them all, I am the last. I never go beyond the wall, and the twos are not anxious to attack me, for they fear my fire gun. But enough for now. Go where you will, except beyond the wall, where the twos are dangerous. There is food in the bins. You may rest in the moss. Reflect upon what you see, and when you have questions, I will answer.
Mazar went his way. Earn refreshed himself in the falling water of the grotto, ate from the bins, then walked upon the gray meadow to consider what he had learned. Here, Mazar, becoming curious, discovered him.
Well then, asked Mazar, and what do you think now?
I understand many things which have puzzled me, said Earn. Also, I regret leaving the one girl who showed a cooperative disposition.
This varies according to the individual, said Mazar. In the olden times we employed many such as domestics, though their mental capacity is not great.
If there were 3 women, would they not produce eggs and eventually 3 children? Mazar made a brusque gesture.
There are no 3 women. There have never been 3 women. The process allows none to form.
What if the process were controlled?
Bah! The ovulation of 1 woman is not susceptible to our control.
Long ago, said Earn, I watched a 1 woman preparing her nest. She laid in clutches of 3. If sufficient eggs were collected, rearranged, and joined, in some cases the female principal would dominate.
This is an unorthodox proposal, said Mazar, and to my knowledge has never been tried. It cannot be feasible. Such women might not be fertile, or they might be freaks indeed.
We are a product of the process, Earn argued. Because there are 2 male eggs to the clutch, we are masculine. If there were 2 female and 1 male, or 3 female, why should not the results be female? As for fertility, we have no knowledge until the matter is put to test.
The process is unthinkable,
roared Mazar, drawing himself erect, crests extended.
I will hear no more.
Dazed by the fury of the old 3's response, Earn stood limp. Slowly he turned and started to walk sea-right toward the wall.
Where are you going?
Mazar called after him. To the swamps.
And what will you do there?
I will find eggs and try to help a 3 woman into being. Mazar glared, and Earn prepared to flee for his life. Then Mazar said,
If your scheme is sound, all my comrades are dead in vain. Existence becomes a mockery.
Perhaps nothing will come of the notion, said Earn. If so, nothing is different.
The venture is dangerous, grumbled Mazar. The 2s will be alert.
I will go down to the shore and swim to the swamp. They will never notice me. In any case, I have no better use to which to put my life.
Go then, said Mazar in his hoarsest voice. I am old and without enterprise. Perhaps our race may yet be regenerated. Go then, take care, and return safely. You and I are the only 3s alive.
Mazar patrolled the wall. At times he ventured out into the pole forest, listening, peering down toward the 2 village. Earn had been gone a long time, or so it seemed. At last, far-off alarms, the cry of, "Freak! Freak! Freak!" Recklessly, 3 crests furiously erect, Mazar plunged toward the sound. Earn appeared through the trees, haggard, streaked with mud, carrying a rush basket. In frantic pursuit came 2 halberdiers, and somewhat to the side, a band of painted 1 men.
"This way!" roared Mazar. "To the wall!"
He brought forth his fire-gun. The halberdiers, in a frenzy, ignored the threat. Earn tottered past him. Mazar pointed to the projector, pulled the trigger. Flame enveloped 4 of the halberdiers, who ran thrashing and flailing through the forest. The others halted. Mazar and Earn retreated to the wall, passed through the gap. The halberdiers, excited to rashness, leaped after them. Mazar swung his sword. One of the 2s lost his head. The others retreated in panic, keening in horror at so much death. Earn slumped upon the ground, cradling the eggs upon his body.
"How many?"
demanded Mazar. "I found 2 nests. I took 3 clutches from each."
"Each nest is separate and each clutch as well? Eggs from different nests may not fuse."
"Each is separate." Mazar carried the corpse to the gap in the wall, flung it forth, then threw the head at the skulking 1 men. None came to challenge him. Once more in the hall, Mazar arranged the eggs on a stone settle. He made a sound of satisfaction.
"In each clutch are 2 round eggs and 1 oval, male and female. and we need not guess at the combinations.
He reflected a moment.
2 males and a female produce the masculine 3. 2 females and a male should exert an equal influence in the opposite direction. There will necessarily be an excess of male eggs. They will yield 2 masculine 3s, possibly more if 3 male eggs are able to fuse.
He made a thoughtful sound.
It is a temptation to attempt the fusion of 4 eggs.
In this case, I would urge caution, suggested Earn. Mazar drew back in surprise and displeasure.
Is your wisdom so much more profound than mine?
Earn made a polite gesture of self-effacement, one of the graces learned at the 2 school. I was born on the shallows among the water babies. Our great enemy was the ogre, who lived in a slough. While I searched for eggs, I saw him again. He is larger than you and I together. His limbs are gross. His head is malformed and hung over with red wattles. Upon his head stand 4 crests. Mazar was silent. He said at last,
We are 3s. Best that we produce other 3s. Well then, to work.
The eggs lay in the cool mud, 3 paces from the water of the pond.
Now to wait, said Mazar. To wait and wonder.
I will help them survive, said Earn. I will bring them food and keep them safe, and if they're female,
there will be 2 females, declared Mazar. Of this I am certain. I am old, but, well, we shall see.
You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.